Hello, scholars. Welcome back to Mr. N's library class. Hope you guys are well rested. But you guys know what time it is, right? It is time to get back to teaching and learning. Got it. All right, guys. As you guys know, for the past 2 weeks now, we've been reading Curious George series, The Adventures of Curious George. All right, this week we're focusing on which book? Curious George Goes to the Hospital. Just by hearing that title, what do you guys think this book is going to be about already? Remember, George is what? Very curious. And how did he end up in the hospital? Guess we'll be finding out today, guys. Hope you guys enjoy the book. All right. As we read along, this is what I want you guys to do. I want you guys to focus on the different characters that you see in this book, okay? Because you're doing comparing and contrasting on your worksheet today. So make sure you pay attention to the different characters. Know everything you need to know about George and the other characters in this book, okay? All right, let's get started. All right, remember the title is Curious George Goes to the Hospital, and the author is Margaret and H.A. Ray. Excellent job. All right, let's read, guys. It says, This is George. He lived with his friend, the man with the yellow hat. He was a good little monkey, but he was always curious. Today, George was curious about the big box on the man's desk. Uh-oh, has George been nosy already? Mm-mm-mm-mm. What could be in it? George could not resist. He simply had to open it. It was full of funny little pieces of all sorts of shapes and all sorts of colors. George took one out. It looked like a piece of candy. Maybe it was candy. Maybe he could eat it. George put the piece in his mouth, and before he knew, he had swallowed it. Guys, what went wrong already? George has opened up a box that's not his, right? Let's see if what he ate is really safe. A while later, the man with the yellow hat came home. Why, George, he said, I see you have already opened the box with the jigsaw puzzle. It was supposed to be a surprise for you. Well, let's go to work on it. Uh-oh. Guess he will find out what George did. Finally, the puzzle was finished. Well, almost finished. One piece was missing. The man looked for it everywhere, but he could not find it. That's strange, he said. It's a brand new puzzle. Well, it cannot be helped. Maybe we'll find it in the morning. Let's go to bed now, George. The next morning, George did not feel well. Who could tell me why he didn't feel well? Remember, what did he do at the beginning of the story? You guys remember, right? Let's see if the man is going to find out. He had a stomach ache and did not want to eat his breakfast. The man was worried. He went to the telephone and called Dr. Baker. I will be over as soon as I can, said the doctor. First, Dr. Baker looked down George's throat and felt his tummy. Then he took out a stethoscope and listened. I'm not sure what's wrong, he said. You better take George to the hospital and have an x-ray taken. I'll call them and let them know you're coming. Guys, do you think George is going to be honest and tell the man what happened? Let's find out. Don't worry, George, said the man when they were driving to the hospital. You have been there before, when you broke your leg. Remember how nice the doctors and nurses were? George held his big rubber ball tight as they walked up the hospital steps. A nurse took them down a long hallway to a room where she gave George something to drink that looked white and tasted sweet. It is called barium, the nurse explained. It helps the doctors find out what is wrong with you, George. In the next room stood a big table, and the doctor was just putting on a heavy apron. Then he gave the man one just like it. George was curious. Would he get one too? No, he did not. You get on that table, George, the doctor said. I'm going to take some x-ray pictures of your insides. He pushed a button and there was a funny noise. There, now you may get up, and we'll have the x-rays develop right away. So this is George taking an x-ray, guys. Guys, I think George knows what he did wrong, but he's not admitting it to it yet. I wonder why. Now let's see. There is something there should not be, said the doctor when they were looking at the x rays. Why, that looks like. I think that must be the piece that was missing in our jigsaw puzzle yesterday, said the man. Well, 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 said the doctor. At least we know now what is wrong with our little patient. I'll tell Dr. Baker right away. George will have to stay at the hospital for a few days. They will put a tube down his throat to get the piece out. It's only a small operation. I will call a nurse and have her take you to the admitting office. Many people were waiting outside the office. George had to wait too. Look, Betsy, the woman next to him said to a little girl, there's Curious George. Betsy looked up for a moment, but she did not even smile. Betsy had never been to a hospital before. She was scared. Finally, it was George's turn. Guys, as you guys can see, Betty said she was scared, right? Did George look scared? I don't know. George looked scared. That could be two different character traits from each character, right? Let's see. A pretty young nurse took him to the next room. My, how many rooms and how many nurses there were. One nurse wrote down a lot of things about George, his name and his address and what was wrong with him. And another nurse put a bracelet around his wrist. It has your name on it, George, she said, so that everybody knows who you are. Then a pretty young nurse came back. My name is Carol, she said. I'm going to take you to your room now. We call it the children's ward, and put you to bed. There'll be lots of children to keep you company. And so it was. There were a lot of children in the room. Some were up and around, others were in their beds with a doctor or a nurse looking after them. Dave was having a blood transfusion. Steve had his leg band-aid and was sitting in a go-kart. Betsy was in a bed looking sad, and George got the bed next to Betsy. Uh-oh, as you guys can see, Betsy did not look too happy. And there's another character, Steve, that had his leg band-aid, right? And there's another character Dave, who was having a blood transfusion. So there's three different characters they're talking about so far. So think about which one you're going to use to compare with George later, okay? George was glad when he was in his bed at last. His tummy was hurting again. The man sat with him for a while. Now I have to leave you, George, he finally said. I'll be back first thing in the morning before they take you to the operating room. Nurse Carol will tuck you in when it's time to sleep. Then he left. George just sat there and cried. Uh-oh, guys. George is not too happy the man left. As he had promised, the man was back early next morning. The nurses were keeping George very busy. One nurse was taking his temperature, one was taking his blood pressure, and one was giving him a pill to make you sleepy, George, he said, and one was getting ready to give him a shot. Uh-oh, a shot? Let's see how George is going to react. It's going to hurt, George, she said, but only for a moment. She took his arm and George let out a scream. But the needles hasn't touched you yet, said the nurse, laughing. There, now it's done. That wasn't so bad, was it? No, it really was not. And anyway, it was over now. By the time the attendant came with the stretcher to wheel him to the operating room, George was getting sleepy. He tried hard to stay awake. He was curious to see what would happen next. What do you guys think will happen next? Let's see. He could see a big table with bright lamps over it and doctors and nurses all around. They had caps on their heads and masks over their faces. Only their eyes were showing. One of the doctors winked at George and patted his head. It was Dr. Baker, who had been to the house when it all started. He looked funny with his mask on, and then George was fast asleep. When George woke up, he did not know what would happen. He did not even know where he was. Then he saw Nurse Carol. It's all done, George, she said. They got the piece out. In a day or two, you'll be running around again. The man had bought him a picture book. But George felt sick and dizzy. His throat was hurting too. He was not even curious about the new book. He closed his eyes again. We'll let him sleep, said Nurse Carol. The more he sleeps, the better. The next morning, George felt better. He even ate a dish of ice cream. Dr. Baker came to see him, and the men, of course, came too. Betsy was watching him from time to time. She seemed a little less sad, but she did not smile. Steve wheeled his go-kart over to George's bed. Tomorrow I can get up and try to walk, he said. Boy, I can hardly wait. I'll take you to the playroom now, George, Nurse Carol said the next morning, and in the afternoon, your friend will come and take you home. The playroom was full of children. A lady was showing Betsy how to use finger paint. There were all sorts of things to play with, even a puppet theater. And that was just the thing for George. He had 4 hands so he could handle 4 puppets at the same time. The children laughed and shouted, and even Betsy, for the first time, smiled a little. George gave a real puppet show with a dragon and a clown and a bear and a policeman. As you guys can see, guys, it looked like George is taking over the whole hospital, making the kids laugh. There was a TV set in the playroom and also a record player. George was curious. If he climbed on a record player and turned the switch, would it go round and round like a real merry-go-round? It did. It started slowly, then it went faster and faster. Whoopee! George had lost his balance and was sailing through the air. Uh-oh. Luckily, George landed on a soft cushion. The children cheered and Betsy smiled again. George was so funny. That's something about George, right, guys? He was very, very funny. So that's something to think about when you do your worksheet. But then the play lady picked George up. That's enough for now, she said. You better take a nap before lunch. We have a big day ahead of us. The mayor is coming to visit the hospital today. And later on, you'll be going home, George. When George woke up, Steve was taking his first steps. A nurse was helping him, and the children were watching. The go-kart was standing there empty. George was curious. He looked at it. Then he climbed into it. Then he grabbed the wheels, and then, while nobody was looking, he wheeled the go-kart right out of the room. George could make the go-kart go very fast. This was fun. Down the hall he went. By now the nurse had noticed that he was gone and came running after him. George! George! She shouted. But George was too excited to listen. He wheeled around the corner and down the ramp to the floor below, where some men were busy pushing lunch carts and a lot of doctors and nurses were showing the mayor around. Uh-oh. Is he going to cause a big mess? George tried to stop, but it was too late. Wham! The go-kart landed right in the middle of everything. Lunch carts tumbled, spinach and scrambled eggs and strawberry jam were all over the floor. People fell over each other, and George was thrown out of the go-kart and landed right in the mayor's arm. What a mess it was! You broke all my dishes, someone cried. He ruined the go-kart, complained another. What would the mayor think of it? Whispered someone else, and so it went. Suddenly, everybody looked up and listened. From above came happy laughter, and stood Betsy laughing and laughing and laughing. Then the children joined in. Then the mayor started laughing. And finally, everybody just laughed and laughed. Everybody, that is, except George. So George looked like he was very embarrassed while everyone else was laughing at him. Betsy came running down the ramp, threw her arms around George and kissed him. Don't be sad, George, she said. The whole thing was so funny. I never laughed so much in my life. I'm so glad you were in the hospital with me. Now the director of the hospital spoke. I am sorry this happened, Mr. Mayor, he said, but I think we'll just clean up the mess and be done with it. George, he went on, you've made a terrible mess, but you also made our sad little Betsy happy again, and that is more than any of us has done. And now I see your friend has just come to take you home. So goodbye, George, and take good care of yourself. The children crowded around the windows, waving goodbye when George and the man with the yellow hat were finally leaving the hospital. As the car was turning into the driveway, Nurse Carol came running after them. Here's a little package with something that belongs to you, George, she called. But don't open it before you are home. George was curious. Well, who would not be? The moment he reached home, He ripped the paper off, tore open the box, and there was the puzzle of the piece of the puzzle that had caused all the trouble. How nice of the doctor to save it for us, said the man with the yellow hat. And now we can finish the puzzle. The end. All right. All right, guys. What do you guys think about the adventures of George at the hospital? Oh, man. All right, guys. Now, this is what I want you guys to do with the worksheet, okay? So guys know what to do. You guys are going to go to the assignment tab on Teams and click on the worksheet, okay? And once you get to the worksheet, this is what you should see, all right? So what we'll be working on today is we're going to be doing a Venn diagram, all right? So this right here is a Venn diagram. And let me explain to you guys what a Venn diagram is. A Venn diagram is an illustration that uses circles, which is what you see right here, to show the relationships among things, right? Or group of things. In this case, this Venn diagram would be used to represent the similarities and differences between two characters of the story. All right? So guys, I want you guys to pick two different characters from the story. Okay, two different characters. And once you guys choose the two different characters, remember we had George, we had Betsy, we had Dave, we had the nurse Carol, the doctor, the man with the hat. You guys could pick any two that you want, okay? And what I want you guys to do is do a compare and contrast with the two different characters, all right? I want you guys to show the differences between both of them. How was they different? All right, so for one character over here, and I'll give you guys an example. All right, so for the first character that I'll pick, of course I will pick George, right? So I'm gonna pick George. So this is George's circle, right here. So this circle right here is for George, just what George is, okay? And the second character I will pick is Betsy. Let's use Betsy, the girl from the hospital, right? All right. So this circle right here will be for Betsy only, okay? So in this circle, we're going to say everything about George, two things about George, right? There's two things total we're going to say about George. What is George like, What happened in the story that was different from Betsy? And on this circle, we're going to talk about Betsy, all right? And in the middle, you guys are going to put, how was they similar? How were the two characters similar? How was they the same? What two things did they do that was the same? What character traits did they have that was the same? Okay, so here is the difference on both characters, and in the middle is how they was both the same in any type of way. All right, so let's do a quick example for George. All right, so one of George's character traits, or something about George in the story that we could pick from, is what? George was very curious, right? That's one thing, right? George was very curious, guys. That's one thing we could say about George, okay? What's one thing we could say about Betsy? Betsy was very unhappy, right? Throughout the story, especially in the beginning, it looked like Betsy was very unhappy. She was in a hospital. She was not too happy at all. Okay, so that's something that's totally different between them, right? Betsy was very unhappy and George was very curious, right? And let's pick up something that was similar between them. What was similar between them? Think about it. What is similar between them? Something that's similar between them is what? They are both at the hospital, right? They're both at the hospital right now. That's something that's similar with both of them, right? Although George is very curious and Betsy was unhappy, something similar between them is what? They're both at the hospital. So that's one thing that's the same. All right, let's do another one. Another one is, what's another thing? We could do something very simple. George is a boy, right? George is a boy. I'm giving a broad example, guys. All right. It's a boy. And is Betsy a boy or girl? Betsy is a girl. That's something that's totally different between them, right? George is a boy and Betsy is a girl. But what is something that is very similar between them? Even though George is a boy and Betsy is a girl, what is something that is very similar? What's another thing that's similar between them? I think something that's similar between them is they both love to laugh. You guys notice how they started laughing? They both love to. You guys notice how they started laughing so hard towards the end? Because something made both of them happy. George made Betsy very happy by doing all those things he wasn't supposed to be doing. And Betsy started laughing really, really, really hard. And you could tell that George love to laugh, right? So that's something they have that's similar, right? They both love to laugh. All right? All right, guys. So those are just different examples. Remember, with George is, remember on this section, you want to put something that's totally different from what Betsy is, okay? In this compare and contrast chart. All right, and in the middle, you're gonna put something that's very similar between them. Okay, so you guys could pick any characters that you want, any characters. All right, guys. I will see you guys next week. We have one more week of reading, and after that, guys, it is time to watch the movie. Are you guys excited? I am. I'm gonna watch it with you guys. Okay. All right, guys. I will see you guys next week. Have a great rest of your week.